Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to SCDawah Live. And today we have an amazing panel and an amazing topic: coronavirus cure, science or God. Assalamu alaikum, guys.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you?
So, mashallah, we have the usual suspects, and we also have another suspect from Southall. So we can have a very interesting panel, actually. I don't think we've ever shared panel together. Myself, Imran, I mean, we're like twins, but I mean, you two are you like twins as well. So,
mashallah, I've been seeing Suboor too much recently, but alhamdulillah, nice to see brother Mansur and brother Hashim. It's been a while, man. SubhanAllah.
Yeah, you should try and dream about other things.
Yeah, I was hoping I wouldn't see you again, but I'm going to see you later again today, SubhanAllah. So,
oh yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So, look, guys, I want to start off on this topic. So, firstly, I want to set the scene of what we're speaking about. There's some memes that have been going around, and alongside the memes, you have this narrative, which has become amplified by this coronavirus, but it's actually existed way before, which is, well, all you religious people, you're praying and you're fasting or whatever, but at the end of the day, it's hard empirical science that's going to find the cure. So there's memes such as, a scientist who's trying to look for the cure, and there's a Buddhist, a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, or whatever, and they're just looking at that person anxiously, hoping they're going to find the cure. We get this. This is just an elongation of the old idea of science versus religion. What's the need to pray? When science can find the cure, or in the words of Lawrence Krauss, I can either pray for you or I can save your life, right? So which one do you prefer? So first thing, let's start with Mansur, then basically Hashim and Imran. So the first thing I want to ask you is, have you felt this narrative in the current crisis?
Me, actually, personally, no. But I think there is this element of this topic that's going around people's head. Especially, I noticed a tweet quite some time ago of a famous, or infamous rather, an ex-Muslim who said the churches are closed, the mosques are closed, so it's a good time to be atheists. I'm just paraphrasing it. Yep, if you've seen it. I thought like this is a very poor logic employed there. I didn't expect someone of this kind of status on the web, in the internet life, to be like this. The schools are closed too. Does it mean it's time to be ignorant now? How does the logic go? So the element is there where people are exploiting this, saying, look, coronavirus is here, it's affecting everyone globally. Yep. Where is God? Your mosques are closed, the churches are closed, even the Kaaba looks like empty, the Mataf area, right? Circumambulating area is empty. So they're trying to make an argument where God doesn't seem to be helping here, and the only help that you can get is through science, through the medical team. Or if you go to the hospital, you might be able to be, at least save your life. So this rhetoric is there, but is this the real case? How do we Muslims see it? Do we say that Allah is absent, God is absent in this? The whole question then comes again on the issues of the problem of suffering. People often conflate this and don't understand that. This happened because of the will of Allah. Everything happens because of the will of Allah. Nothing in this world can happen except His will. The question now is Allah, to be termed someone who's not benevolent because of this suffering? That's the question to ask. But if we were to link this with the wisdom of Allah, how things happen and why things happen, then you will realize that actually, yes, good and evil happens. Sometimes they happen because of what we have earned. Sometimes you will see that we have polluted the land and the sea. We have corrupted the environment, and we are blaming Allah for this. So we need to distinguish between the human causes and the natural causes of the suffering that we see, or the apparent evil that we see, and then we can understand what's going on here. So yes, the rhetoric is out there, but people often get confused and look at like it's either or actually we look at it that yes, it's caused for a reason. We know why pandemics happen from the Islamic point of view, and we know also why these kind of things may happen from the scientific point of view, and we don't consider this to be a conflict in any way or shape.
Absolutely. And I think that tweet sort of summarized it, because I saw the very same tweet, in fact. And I don't want to give credit to ignoramuses, so I'm not going to
No
mention
need
the
to name
person's
them.
name. Yeah, but it was such a funny tweet, because I was actually thinking, that's kind of interesting, because you actually need God to justify science in the first place. So historically, you needed what they call the axial age. You needed this time that people were trying to explore the world. So God is the sort of the genesis of the scientific method. On top of that, how do you justify your reason without God? And reason is what you use to do science. And then there's the uniformity of nature, or the valuing of truth and morals, which is what science is based upon. So science needs a justification, and that justification is God. So when they use it against God, they don't realize that they're putting the cart before the horse. They can't have it both ways. So Imran, I want to push you on this, because I know you're pretty much like you have those fish tanks, and you have those things at the bottom which are just eating all of the the waste in the tank. So I've seen that on YouTube. You seem to be living off atheism and responding to every single time one of them squeaks the chair. So you're quite in tune with the way they think, which is very good, alhamdulillah. So let me know of what you've seen in this virus and how they're speaking about science versus religion.
Okay, firstly, bro, I'll deal with your sort of metaphors and analogies that you use in regards to me offline, but addressing your point right now. So I have noticed subtle things, bro. Like, for example, even a little while back on sort of mainstream media, you had these news reports which were, it was very subtle. So you had the images of the Kaaba being empty, Islamic lands being empty, and it was subtle little catchphrases which were thrown in there, like, oh, even faith couldn't help, so it's this type of indirect indoctrination that seems to be going on in regards to these views, or pushing of these views. But I think there's a lot here that we can sort of unravel in regards to science and Islam, and how they sort of, what is the sort of link between the two? Is there a link between the two? Is science against Islam, or is it Islam against science? How does this all work, right? But like you said, I think some of the points we've mentioned already, which are very important, which is that when you think about Islam and science, the relationship between the two is very deep, whether you look at it historically, whether you look at it even foundationally, like you mentioned already. So like with every other thing, science itself has axioms. It has some fundamental principles that it rests upon, such as, you need uniformity in nature, meaning you need a universe which is ordered enough and it follows a particular pattern, and it's consistent with that over time. And you need a rational mind that can pick up on these consistencies and on this order. And without either one of these two, without a rational mind or a uniform universe, you can't have science in the first place. Yep. And both of these things, a rational mind that has truth-bearing faculties and a uniform universe which follows a particular order and pattern, both cannot be accounted for on atheism. Yep. Right? So that's the contradiction right there. So when you start to sort of unravel this whole discussion about Islam and science, you start to see, actually, if anything, Islam is what makes sense of science. Without God, without Islam, you can't even begin to account for this method, this amazing method that we have to study and understand the world. But obviously, we'll sort of, I guess, unravel these things further on as we inshallah.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point that you made, that they try and pit science versus God when
Suboor, so I'll have to relog in.
You can't hear me? You can't hear me?
Just let me relog in just one sec.
Okay, no problem. I'll add you again once you come back. Okay, so Imran, I've heard you in the past basically explain the same example about the rational mind and the rationally accessible universe, using the analogy of the key and the lock, right? So you have to have both. You have to have the key and you have to have the lock that fit perfectly in order for us to actually understand what's happening on Andromeda. And you've given this sort of evolutionary argument against that point as well. So what I want to move the discussion on to briefly, when I'm speaking to Hashim. Hashim, you can hear me, right?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, sorry about that.
So something that Mansur touched upon, but something which is not obviously related directly to the coronavirus cure, but something that's related to why we're looking for the cure, is the fact that it's causing evil and suffering. And people are going to be asking the question, why does God allow something like this to happen? When you hear these sorts of things, I mean, Mansur obviously gave the answer that relates to a particular narration of the Prophet ﷺ, but generally, is it the case that if God is all loving and God is all powerful, then evil should not exist. I mean, what do you think of that argument?
Yeah, that's I think an argument which the atheists bring up many times. So the first thing we need to realize is that we ourselves are a creation that did not just pop out of existence from nowhere. We were created here, and we were created for a purpose. And as someone who believes in God, we firmly believe that everything that happens in our life is a test. So whether it's a calamity that comes, or whether it's some sort of whether it's an earthquake, whether it's a virus, a disease, or anything like that. I mean, all of this, it's to test us basically in a way, or somehow to see how we react in such circumstances. Not everybody is saying that, oh, God is doing this on purpose to make sure that whether to test you whether you believe in this way or not. It's something that we as Muslims, we internalize, that everything that happens to us is either a punishment or it's a test, and whatever comes towards us, we try our utmost to handle it and to not to basically stop believing in the Creator, the very reason that we are here. So our bodies, ourselves, we wouldn't exist if it wasn't for God creating us in the first place. And we are a property of the Creator. So when we die, we say Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un.
Yeah.
That is, in Allah we to Allah we belong, and to Him is our return. So whether it's a child, whether it's an adult, doesn't matter. It is ultimately you are the one who was created by God. You wouldn't exist otherwise. So whether He wants to test you in a very hard way or in a different way, or even give you some rewards, for example, even the good things that come to us, that is a test. So for example, if you one day become, I don't know, get some inheritance and you become a millionaire overnight, that is a test. How are you going to use your money? How are you going to, so everything, whether it's good or bad in this life, is a test, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good way of putting it, that look, at the end of the day, Allah did not create us. God did not create us for a cosmic disco party, And then we have the question, well, why did the disco ball stop? Why did the music stop? Why did we run out of drinks? The very presumption that the life that we live is a life of enjoyment and entertainment and of ease and comfort, and is disrupted, therefore there's no God, is based upon that fundamental misunderstanding. So I want to move on to Mansur, to an interesting perspective. Mike Jones has put up the verse, and we will surely test you with something of fear and hunger and loss and wealth of lives and fruit, and give you good tidings and give good tidings to the patient. So I want to ask you a question from your experience, and alhamdulillah, you're probably a lot more experienced than in this than perhaps some of us who are a bit younger. How much have you found that people going through suffering allows them to be better people afterwards, once they've gone through this type of suffering of any sort?
Okay. This can be related to personal experience that I have seen in my workplace, or it could be the interactions that I have with people in Speaker's Corner, for example. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers.
Yes. So as we were saying, so when people are afflicted or they suffer something from the loss of something, remember we're talking about loss of something, not entire loss of everything. As Allah says, okay, something from the loss of life or their crops, and could be things like this, hunger or fear. This actually brings people back to introspection, and they start reflecting on it. I mean, I have seen countless number of parents in the prayer rooms in the hospital, which I have been working for a number of years, decades, and I see how, looking at the way they pray, looking at the way they start crying, and even if you look at the way they're actually praying the prayer itself, that they haven't been accustomed to prayer regularly before, and they're trying to now come back to the prayers. And the plea they're making to Allah, by shedding their tears, you can see all the sincerity, like, oh, I'll be good now, I'm going to be patient, get this thing away from what's happening to my children, for example. they are becoming a totally different person. I mean, obviously, I mean, I haven't met many who comes back again, because I mean, our job is not for the patients when their families when they're ill to come to the hospital again and again. Once they're well and cured, they should not come to us anymore. So when we see the same family coming here, maybe another child who has been affected by the disease, and you can see the gratefulness, the gratitude that they have, that how Allah has kept them firm and carried them to live their life with this firm conviction. It is amazing to see. I mean, normally you would see when someone's lost a child or something, they will be in a shock, and this grief goes on for a long time, and they may go severely depressed for a long time. But I have seen parents, they have become even closer to Allah, and they increase their goodness in terms of how they look at their lives, and in terms of how they themselves worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They have become a changed person themselves. And I remember some of the comments they were saying, this is all from Allah, and Allah can take the life whenever He wants to, because He's the one who gave us life in the first place.
Yep.
So yes, definitely people change, and they change for better. The people I've seen, and in Speaker's Corner, that from the experiences as well, there are some people, they may have totally gone the other extreme, right? It's because, in my estimation, is they don't understand the reasons why these things are happening in the first place, why Allah is testing us with some of the loss of life or something, and they lose their faith. And you will see that these people, their arguments of going away from faith rest upon this emotional suffering they had in the first place. And when we have spoken to some of them, you will see that they have actually realize that, okay, fine, I can understand now why. So it's the grand scheme of things where they need to connect everything is something that's missing in the first place. So it can turn people into two different extremes, depending on their understanding of the reality and understanding of why things happen. So yes, there are spectrum of how people react to the test.
Absolutely, and I think a hospital is the perfect place to actually see human raw emotion, because you're dealing with the closest relationships between parents and children, and you're seeing people in their raw nature when they're dealing with severe trauma, when they're dealing with these issues. And that's definitely been my experience when I have visited hospitals, that when you do go to the prayer room, it is a very sad place, and it has a very different type of khushu in that prayer than the prayers that you have just an average mosque in a street market. So firstly, Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Imran, Jazakallah khair for joining us.
Welcome, brothers. Barakallah feek, inshallah.
How are you doing today?
Alhamdulillah. Well, I just actually just finished from work, so I've just arrived a little bit late. But I have to echo what Mansur just said. And you brought to mind something an experience that I had when I was a very young doctor, and I was working in A&E in children's medicine, pediatrics, and we had a child that came in from an Afghan mother and father who brought their child in, and the child had some sort of genetic problem, so something wrong with the heart, and the saturation levels of the child at the time were sort of between 78 and 86, very, very low. And we go into sort of this automatic pilot mode, and I'm sort of doing all these things to try and, and there is a sense of urgency that I'm feeling. And I look, and this is sort of in the middle of the night, 3 or 4 in the morning, and the parents have like a special passport that allows them to sort of bypass all of the administration to just get seen quickly. And I look at these, as I'm doing work, I'm looking at these parents, and I just sense just a calmness, an absolute. They were just still with this whole experience. And what I afterwards, when after we'd done all the initial stabilization and everything, and we'd done what we could, I was speaking to them just to sort of make sure they were well, and they were very, very almost relaxed about the whole situation. And they said exactly what Brother Mansur just said. Allah gave us our son, and if He wants him back, He can have him back, and we're grateful for the time that we have with him. And for me, as you think of yourself, we do have this sort of perception about ourselves as being sort of knowing things, but there's a different whole level of spiritually knowing and being aware and being connected. And it just made me feel at that time how poor my own personal connection at that time was. And I think that the adversity for them had definitely had a role in connecting them to Allah, subhanAllah. it was an amazing experience to me, and you just reminded me of that, Brother Mansur, mashallah.
Jazakallah khair. That was, that was, I mean, when you build a picture like that, being a parent, I can imagine myself being in a very similar situation. But I cannot imagine myself with that calmness that they had, the iman that they had. And your true self comes at a time of crisis. Everybody has a shell, and the shell breaks at a time of crisis. So, Dr. Imran, what we're speaking about today is coronavirus cure, science, or God. So, just to give you the backdrop, at the moment, obviously, the world is in crisis. People are dying. People are gasping for air. People are worried about the economic situation. There's political instability. And right now, we are finding that atheists are using this as an opportunity to attack religion. So they'll have these sort of memes where a scientist is looking for a cure and religious people are looking on. Or they say, look for the cure, don't pray, prayer doesn't work. Science or God, it's not one, it doesn't go together. Now, as a practicing, believing Muslim who is on the front line in terms of dealing with these types of issues, how do you feel, first, without challenging that narrative, how do you feel about people that use this particular time to push a particular ideology?
I think in any time of crisis, to use that crisis as a tool to further your own aims, whatever they might be, is probably not ethical. Just thinking in that way, unless you're doing something that's going to make that person's existence in some way better for them, their experience personally better for them. So often when I'll come across people who are not of a Muslim background, for example, who are having some sort of difficulty, whether there's deciding about their parent wanting to, should we be resuscitating them if they were to sort of have a heart attack or something like this. One of the things I will do for that person, even though I'm not whatever religion their background they are from, and if they happen to be sort of Christian or whatever, is I will ask them to draw some strength from whatever they have faith in as a mechanism to try and improve their own experience of what they're going through. Because spirituality, the need for the human being to connect to the divine is sort of throughout. And so what I wouldn't do is push my own view at that time, because that would be unethical to do that.
Yeah.
And by even directing someone towards spirituality that I disagree with, my aim in that is to try to get them to have a better experience for them personally. So ethically, I'm trying to help them. Mm-hmm. The people who try and use this to sort of draw you away from the definite benefit we get from having a faith in a higher power, all you're doing is you're detracting from people. You're making their life worse. There's no benefit in telling someone everything is nihilistic, nothing really matters. What you're actually doing is you're taking away any benefit they may derive from that, even if you disagree with their position. So, and I feel it's a shame, and it really shows you that the motivations behind the atheists who do this isn't a good motivation. It isn't to help anyone. In fact, it's detracting from people's personal experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something very dark about that sort of behavior.
Absolutely.
It kind of reminds me of Noam Chomsky. Although he's an atheist, although he's somebody who essentially has to accept from some form of nihilism, I remember reading about him that he wrote this, he had this interview, and it's on his website, where he was criticizing new atheism because he doesn't like this type of evangelical atheism. And he said, if a grieving mother is hopeful that she's going to see her child in the next life, I'm not there to give her a lesson in epistemology.
Subhanallah.
Right? And for me, I really like Chomsky, and one of the reasons why I like him is because of stuff like this. Now, I'm not saying we believe in delusions, right?
Yeah.
However, let's have a serious conversation about faith. Is faith useful? What is faith? Is it true? But don't do this at this particular time. And I think that's definitely something that we need to not let it slip. When people are using these opportunities, we need to take them into account. Hashim, any thoughts on this? You're mute. You're on mute.
Yeah. you're absolutely right. I mean, we do have different kinds of believers and disbelievers as well. So not all atheists are bad, and not all believing people are good. So everybody, depending on what kind of experiences they had in their lives, I think they do mature. So many of these atheists, once they've gone through suffering, they've gone through some loss in their life or some sort of calamity or something, I think it brings out a more sensitive or much more, what do you say, mature person at the end. And Chomsky is a very good example of that. I think many people agree with him, even though they might not disagree. Sorry, they might disagree with his, not believing in God and so on. But it's something that we all go through, and that is the reason that this life is a test, and is something that we all have to basically take lessons from. So our life, depending on our circumstances, makes us either better or in some cases worse, depending on what circumstances you are in. But yeah, we should always not take these kinds of suffering and this kind of pandemics or this kind of calamities as a springboard to advance our own agendas, whatever that might be. This is a time where we should all work together. So we should all come together, whether you believe in a religion or you don't believe in a religion, you're a God, you believe in God, or you're an atheist or agnostic, whatever. Now is the time, because everybody understands human rights. Yes, we all agree with it, that this human rights that we have kind of come to believe as part of the society, that we all should respect, regardless of their faith or lack thereof. So in the Quran, there's an ayah in chapter 5, verse 32, where it says, to save one life is as if you have saved the whole of mankind. And this is beautiful. You know, this, I think all the doctors and all the scientists and everybody would actually, at least those who think objectively, will believe that this is something very beautiful. That we do not discriminate people based on their religion or based on their faith or lack thereof. So when you're a doctor, you take the oath to ensure that there's no discrimination. And this is something that Islam also agrees with. And yeah, there's many things which Islam and science kind of agree with, and humanity in general would agree with. So we are here to make sure that the suffering of the people is elevated. It's not, regardless of the faith. I mean, this is a teaching of the Prophet ﷺ, when he used to basically, when he used to come across someone who's suffering, he would help them. Whether, I mean, even small ants, if they were basically being trampled on purpose or set on fire or something, he would speak out against, let alone human beings. So it's a beautiful example in our faith, in our religion, where we have to all agree and come to terms with the understanding that there is suffering in this world, and there's going to be tests, and there's going to be calamities, and we all should pull together as one ummah, as one humanity.
You know, I really love that message, because that kind of reminds me of during Darwin's last years, he was obviously very unpopular amongst some religious circles because of the theory that he came up with. And, you know, there's this whole use of him against atheism. And he was really good friends with Asa Gray, who was a practicing Christian, and he was a supporter of Darwin's theory, and he subscribed to it. So they both had a common denominator of science, which they believed was something beneficial for mankind. And regardless of their differences, they were willing to basically have a dialogue, work together. I mean, there wasn't an issue in this regard. So I definitely think that's a message that we need to push out, that this isn't a time to try and win some scores. However, let's look at their logical argument now. So far, what we've looked at is what's their narrative, what a cheap shot their narrative is, and we touched a little bit about how the problem of evil in regards to this virus is not really an intellectual problem. We have an answer for it. But now let's look at their actual argument, deconstruct it. So Imran, is there a problem with a Muslim believing in God and doing science? Is God somehow going to be a barrier between that Muslim and doing science?
Well, the simple answer is no, right? So we can establish this through a few different perspectives. Firstly, this whole idea that's out there that Islam is against science, or Islam is, it just doesn't want you to be progressive in this way, to study the world, to understand the world, to reflect upon the world around you and learn about the world. This is not true. Because even if you go to the source text, if you go to the Quran, there are many verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encourages us to reflect, to look, to observe, to study. There is a beautiful verse in the 16th chapter of the Quran, verse 78, where Allah says, and that He brought us out of our mother's wombs, not knowing anything. And then He gave us hearing and sight and minds so that we may be grateful. And this is a very powerful verse, bro, because what it does is, what God is giving us an insight into are the sort of fundamental requirements that we need for science, which is senses, hearing and sight. So God is referring to the fact that He gave us the ability to observe the world and study the world and understand it empirically, and that He gave us minds so that not only can we see it and observe it, but then when we do those observations, we can really understand it, and we can sort of, come up with theories and ideas and all of these amazing things, right? So that foundation is there within the Quran itself. God is reminding us He made us a creature which has the ability to study the world and reflect upon it and to understand it, right? But why? The core objective is so that we're grateful when we're doing this, so that when we do have advancements in medicine and we do find cures, etc., that we always remember that He is the one that gave us the ability to find this in the first place, right? And that therefore becomes a form of worship, that we are acknowledging our Creator through doing the science itself. And that's a beautiful thing. Another important point here is that Islam also gives us that fundamental drive and motivation to do the science, to discover the cure, to find these new things, because we understand that God created us as a very unique creature, as a vicegerent upon earth. And therefore we are here to serve humanity as well, to take care of other people, right? And by doing this, again, we're worshiping our Creator. So there's this underlying fundamental drive that's there that Islam gives us to, develop and move forward in the sciences, to find cures, etc.
Yeah.
The other thing we need to sort of understand as well is that Islam isn't averse to science, and I think this was the fundamental understanding that the Muslims had, especially if you look at Islamic Spain, that allowed them to develop the things that they developed, progress in the way that they progressed, right? So there is no sort of contradiction between Islam and science. There is no sort of either science or Islam. If anything, Islam encourages us to study the world and understand the world. And it's interesting because Bertrand Russell himself, he when he summarized, or he tried to explain what science was, he said, science is an attempt to discover by means of observations and reasoning based upon it particular facts about the world, very similar to the points that Allah mentions in the Quran over 1400 years ago. The same fundamental principles are there highlighted. So there is no contradiction there. If anything, Muslims should get involved in the science, should look for cures, should engage in the different sciences, right? There is no contradiction there. But unfortunately, there is a narrative that's being pushed, and it's being pushed deliberately, because it seems like at least some of the atheists, such as Richard Dawkins, etc., they want to claim science for themselves. They want to detach science from religion, so they can, in this way, at least keep people away from looking into religion. Because one of the things Dr. Imran mentioned, which is very powerful, was that putting all this aside, when you're there on the ground and you're talking with real people and you're dealing with real life situations, that's not a time to sort of say, look, my religion is true or your way is wrong. However, what he does is he expounds upon an underlying human principle, which is this understanding that we as human beings realize that there is meaning to life. Our nature, by our very nature, we recognize that there is a deeper meaning to life, and things around us have meaning. We have meaning. And it's pointing this out to people in a very general way, which allows them, gives them the ability and strength to move forward in that situation. And what's happened in the world that we live in today, bro, the society that we live in today, it's extremely secular. It's so disconnected itself from God. And when things are good, when things are, comfortable, we don't feel the need to turn to God. We don't feel the need to rely upon God, because we have this false sense of independence. But it's in times like this, when we're suffering and we're going through hardships and trials, and obviously the doctors, amidst us now, experience this on a daily basis. They see this amongst people, right? That people really, that true nature of the human being comes out, and they recognize that, there is this sense of dependence that the human being has, and that human being inclines towards something that's beyond them at that point. And that may be a doorway, bro, at that point. That's an opportunity for someone to explore these realities. And maybe it'll be possible that in the next several years in the future, they will come to Islam. But I think it's very wise what the doctor does is is just open that door for them in a very sort of human way, in a very sort of natural way, which is going to help them in that immediate time. And it's that help they receive through that reality in that moment that will, inshallah, flourish in the future into something more beautiful. And maybe that will be a means for their guidance in the future, inshallah. So yeah, just in a nutshell, to summarize, there is no conflict between the two at all. Islam and science can go hand in hand. If anything, Islam gives us the foundations of science, and it gives us the motivation and the drive that we need to do the science. Because if you think about it, bro, if you remove God and you see the world from a very nihilistic perspective, right, from an existentially nihilistic perspective, there is no meaning, there is no drive. Then if you really sort of follow that through, well, where is the drive then to look for the cure? Where is the drive then to save lives? Where is the drive then to find those new things in the world, and so on and so forth? Because at the end of the day, nihilism, suggests that it's all pointless. It's all pointless. So I think religion does inject that very needed dose of meaning in life that we need for us to be able to progress as humanity in every way, shape, and form.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. It kind of reminds me of Nietzsche when he said that science is a carcass of Christianity. It's a remnant of Christianity because of, the will to truth, to find out what the truth is about the world. So I want to, definitely echo what you're saying here. And I think I want to get Imran and Hashim to give some thoughts on it. But before that, I want to ask Mansur a bit of a technical question here. So their fundamental argument, when we break it down from a logical perspective, is that of causality, right? So they're saying because of physical causation, that effects have causes which are empirically verified. Anything to do with God or prayer, right, doesn't fit in that scientific equation. So praying cannot be shown to work from that perspective, right? They'll try and say there's been experiments done on prayer or whatever it is. So their argument is this: when you study the world, you study the world assuming every effect has a cause which is natural, which is observable. God doesn't come in that process. Therefore, God is a hindrance to a Muslim practicing science at a conceptual level. What would your response be to that?
Do you mind just repeating your last statement? Because
yeah. So they'll say, they'll say conceptually, you're basically looking at the world and you're trying to look at a physical symptom, physical disease, and you're trying to find physical cures. They're saying in that process, there's no God. It's just you physically looking for cures, right? So you're basically acting like an atheist. You're looking for a physical cure. You're not praying, right? So that's their point, that how can you be a Muslim and believe in physical causality in the same way?
Sure. I mean, if you look at from the Islamic perspective, we don't just simply say that if you pray to God, God is going to answer all your prayers here the way you want. Imagine I pray, I want to become a millionaire, for example. I want all these houses and I want all this wealth and money and fame. If this were to happen to every individual, God responding to their prayers, and you can see the chaos is going to be. Imagine someone say, I don't like this guy, and they pray to God, I want this person to be totally annihilated or to be destroyed. I don't like this political leader, I want him to be dead. I mean, these kind of prayers people can have, and if you want them to be totally answered the way you want, then the world will be in a chaos. So what we say is the prayers are answered by Allah in His wisdom through the ways that He seems fit. So He can answer sometimes which is beneficial for you, and sometimes which is not beneficial for you, who might, give the answer in terms of the response in the hereafter. And this goes same for the prayers or pleas or the request even the non-believers make towards God. So God listens to everyone's prayer because He's someone who's all hearing, and He doesn't let things go just like that because someone's asking for help. Because if you ask Allah, if you ask God, He'll always listen to your plea. But how He responds to it, it depends on the wisdom that Allah applies in responding to your request and prayers. So when we look at causality in terms of how people look at the cure, I mean, if you think about it, look, Allah didn't tell us, neither did His Prophet, that these things are happening by themselves through causes of natural means. Things happen, like we know the very famous hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where He said Allah has caused he's made diseases, but he's made cure for all of them except one, which happens to be death, for example. So there are diseases that will come for whatever reasons it will happen, but there are cures for it. And he did not simply tell us to stay still and don't do anything, but look for cure, look for the treatment, and don't waste your time looking for the treatment or a cure for death, because death is going to be inevitable. That's one of the things, that the fact of life. So there's no way running for it, find a cure for death. So we look at things holistically, the things, the cause of things and the effects that things happen. And if you divorce the science behind these things, the natural reasons or natural causation, to the divine plan, then this is where the problem starts. We have to merge these two. And from an atheistic perspective, there is no creator, there is no lawgiver, there is no one who oversees the affairs of everything. So they have to assign a natural cause to it. But how many times have we seen that people are very much ill? I mean, Dr. Imran can testify to this. Doctors have given up, saying that's it. I'm afraid you won't be able to make it. And then miraculously, I mean, I have to use this word miraculously because that's what they will have to admit, the patient survives without any reason whatsoever, comes back to normality and comes back to normal health. How did that happen? When the medical science, medical establishment, through natural causation, we've given up all the hope, but somehow it was overturned. So, I mean, if you think everything is just natural causation, then how do you account for all of these experiences that people see? I mean, things just turn over without any kind of apparent causes. This is where we say this is due to the plan of Allah and the will of Allah. He can stop people from getting murdered or killed, even though it looks like it's inevitable because of the situation, but still people may survive. So there has to be this connection that's made. So I don't view, or Muslims shouldn't view, that there is a conflict between the natural causation of things, how we look at things, and the divine overall plan and scheme of things within this cosmos from Allah Almighty Subhanahu wa Ta'ala.
That's absolutely a very concise way of shutting down that argument, that causality, physical causality, means that you somehow are denying God. Because like you mentioned, the Prophet ﷺ told us every disease has a cure, look for the cure, right? So physically looking for the cure is not denying God, is not challenging God, is in fact doing what God wants us to do. And when you were speaking, I was sort of thinking about the narration of the Prophet ﷺ, where he teaches us to tie the camel and then put your trust in Allah. So, there seems to be this false perception, in the name of God, and just go and, walk into a place which is infected by corona, right? And in fact, some Muslims, even here in Pakistan, while I'm here, very small minority, but they have this belief that somehow fearing or taking precautions from coronavirus is tantamount to having a weak faith in Allah. Right? I mean, people saying, look, I go and do wudu and I go to the mosque, and I don't fear this virus. When in fact, Islam teaches us not to be foolish, right? To understand that Allah has created this physical world with causes and effects and instruments. And utilizing these instruments is part and parcel of life and something that Allah wants us to do. Okay, now I want to, obviously we spoke about a little bit earlier about the conflict between science and God from the perspective of looking for a cure. Now, I want to ask Dr. Imran here. So, when you are dealing with, obviously, an environment that you can see that death is all around you, and sometimes things seem a bit hopeless, is it fair to say, or is it a bit of an overstatement, or is it fair to say that having faith gives you that extra mileage that you don't get if you don't have faith, in regards to being persistent, being motivated, and carrying through those dark hours in which you're seeing people dying and people becoming hopeless and despairing?
I think that's a very interesting question, because I've done a lot of different positions over the years, and I worked in a an oncology department, where I used to do on nights on call, where I was the only doctor within the hospital. And these are people who are sort of at the end of their life in terms of the cancer so advanced, the treatments are not helping, and this person may have a few days, few hours, because even with all our knowledge, we can only guess at the times that somebody may expire. And in these sorts of environments, what you find is that definitely the things that people use to motivate themselves is the spiritual aspects of their lives. If they didn't have them in the beginning, they develop them during this time. It's a rapid development. It's almost like the adage about throwing the atheist out of the plane and suddenly on the way down he believes in God. It's sort of a transition that you see like this. But as a practitioner, I see clinicians all around me, and you still have to observe sort of funny behavior. Well, I wouldn't call it funny behavior, but behavior that deals with sort of hoping that there's a supernatural. So you will see things like, knock on wood, I'll be fine, touch wood, and these are referring to superstitions about supernatural spirits that would save you from some sort of calamity. And so this will come from anybody. It doesn't matter about your theistic position or atheistic position. And definitely what you see amongst people who have some sort of faith-based, particularly, obviously I speak to a lot of Muslims, and the thing that comes to fore for us, the foremost in our minds, is exactly the hadith that you gave. Tie your camel and put your trust in Allah. So we will wear all of our equipment, we will gather all of our information before we go into an environment, and we trust in Allah that we've tied our camel and Allah will protect us from this. Now that gives us a certain resilience. Resilience in the sense of if we develop, say if I have a cough for a couple of days, I don't become extremely worried about this. What I would do is I would sort of, again, have that trust in Allah that if my time is set, the time that I'm born and the time that I leave this earth, nothing will change that. I am unable to change that. I have to live my life the best that I can, doing the best that I can for the sake of Allah until that moment comes. And what that gives you is a certain defiance in the face of possibly overwhelming odds. That you will persist in whatever you think is the right thing to do, despite whatever may come your way. And I think definitely that gives you a lot of resilience, and it helps because you have to flip it and think of the alternative. What's the alternative? That you're just going to turn into worm food. Nothing really matters.
Yeah.
Whether you save this life or not, there's 25,000 people dying every day of hunger, of other things. So what point is it in me putting my own life at risk to save this one life? And from our perspective, if you save, as the brother mentioned before, Brother Hashim was mentioning, if you save one life, it's as if you saved all of mankind. So our whole religious basis completely changes our approach to how we deal with people and how we deal with adversity. And definitely, I think it's a beneficial thing. Alhamdulillah. Yeah.
And I like the way that you're speaking from experience, because there's definitely an extra weight when you're saying, and even when you're speaking, I can feel in your voice that you've gone through those hours, you've seen those faces, and this is the experience of life that you cannot get from books. I mean, one of my favorite books is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He was in the concentration camp, and then he came out, and he speaks about the experiences of people who survived and how they survived, and having a hope and meaning and value to life, that this suffering has a meaning, allowed them to take it further, allowed them to survive. And those people who became hopeless, they simply died. They simply were finished. And when you were speaking, I was also thinking about there's this doctor who contacted us 10 years ago, and it's quite interesting. He was a militant atheist, and he went through an experience that Mansur mentioned, where he himself ended up as a doctor being a patient, and basically becoming pretty much terminally ill. The doctors were very, very much sure that he's not going to recover, he's going to be finished. And what he did is, lying in his bed, being a militant atheist, he still said these words. He said, God, if you take me out of this, I'll be grateful.
Subhanallah.
He said, take me out of this, I'll be grateful. Okay, so he said that a little bit of time after that, I'm not sure, weeks, days, whatever it is, he made a recovery which was phenomenal, which was not expected, and which surprised the people that were looking after him. And once he went through that and he came out, he said, as soon as I came out and I was well, I just started thinking to myself, because at that point he started believing in God. He said, once I came out and I went back to my comfort, I basically started thinking the human body has this tendency of curing itself. It was a natural event, you know, and he just reverse engineered everything, that no, it wasn't an act of God, right? So the prayer he forgot, the belief in God that he temporarily had after his treatment, he lost, and he went back to basically being an atheist. And then when I met him, he basically said that I realized I was wrong and that I was making excuses and this was God. And I just want to share something that I said, because he really wanted to, you know, learn about Islam. So me and him, we went to Regent's Park Mosque. And in Regent's Park Mosque, we, you know, downstairs, there's a restaurant, for those of you who've been there, right? So I was eating with him in the restaurant there, and the Maghrib azan went off. So I said, look, we're going to go upstairs and pray. What's interesting is that we were talking about death a lot. Like, he was very much fixated on death. And when we went to go pray, I said to him, can you sit in the back? You know, in the back, they have some chairs. I said, can you sit in the back and I'll pray? When I started praying, subhanAllah, the Imam was reciting the very verses about death that were exactly perfect for the conversation we were previously having. It was almost like he was listening to our conversation and he decided to use these verses. Anyway, so once I did salam, I turned around and looked at the chair where he was sitting, and he wasn't there. He was gone. So I started thinking, what's happened? You know, we had a nice chat, you know, we were eating, and, you know, where is this guy? And I looked around and I saw that he was standing in prayer. No wudu, no nothing. And I just, you know, let him, and he didn't even know what he was just following. So then I met him again and I said, what happened? And he said, when I saw you guys praying, I couldn't stop myself. It was too irresistible, right? And, you know, his whole story just reminded me of the power of humility, the power of humility. When he was a private doctor who had a practice on Great Portland Street, quite successful. He knew all this philosophical jargon about why God doesn't exist. But his own personal experience and his own pain and his own dark moments in which he called upon Allah, this broke all of his atheism. It was nothing intellectual, right? And that's why the sort of topics that we're touching upon today, these are really impactful. And these stories are really impactful. And we need to understand that the human being fundamentally is not a robot. Yeah, they're not a robot. They have emotion, they have feelings, and you know, they can have spiritual awakenings based upon feelings. Based upon experiences that they go through, including obviously suffering and pain that we go through because of the coronavirus. So Hashim, I want to bring something in here. You've obviously dealt with all sorts of characters in Speaker's Corner for a number of years now. And obviously, like we just spoke about, that arrogance is broken through pain, it's broken through suffering, it's broken through near-death experiences. What has your experience been with people that come across as visibly arrogant and people who are not arrogant in how they receive the message of Islam?
That's an interesting question. I believe it depends whom you're asking and whom you're talking to. So everyone's got their own different perspective, their own subjective understanding of the world around them. And unfortunately, some people are arrogant. I mean, I've come across quite a number of atheists who would do anything to make the excuse that there is no God. So it doesn't matter what examples you show them, whether from your own experiences or from even from the experiences of other people. They are just not willing to believe that there is a God. So everything goes except God for them. And this is where I think it's the interesting question you asked Mansur earlier with regards to causality and whether how they see the world, whether it's everything has to be some sort of empirical evidence for them, so verifiable and testable. But if you ask them questions, simple questions like, do you visit a doctor? And have you actually looked at his certificate, whether he's qualified? Yes, no offense to the doctors here, but in the NHS, they wouldn't employ you just nilly-willy. They will obviously employ you based on your credentials, and that is how it is. But when we go to the doctor, we don't ask them for the credentials. Why? Because we trust in the NHS. We trust that they have actually gone through the proper checks and vetting, and we believe them. Now, this is testimony. This is not empirical evidence. So maybe a few doctors who might not be really qualified, they might get through the net, and they might be found out later on that they were not qualified, and then they get sacked. So not everything that we experience in our life, yes, be it even our own selves, for example, if I were to ask that same atheist who doesn't believe in God, I ask him, okay, how would we measure whom do you love more, your spouse, your mother, or your children? And you see, there's no love meter out there where you can say, okay, he loves X person more than Y. You know what I mean? So there are things in our life where we don't have to basically rely on empirical evidence for everything. So there are things in our lives which we go by testimony, which we go by the experience of other people or other organizations, and we believe their checks and their credentials. Based on that, we actually believe them. But when we, in our own life, if we were to look at everything and test and verify empirically, I think it'll be an impossible life for any one of us to live, even within the 24 hours you live, it would be quite kind of almost impossible. So yeah, dealing with people who are arrogant, sometimes you have to deal with them in a more rational way. So you ask them, okay, you think about all this empirical evidence. How do you process it? Yeah, using your reasoning, using your own consciousness. Do you have any evidence that you have consciousness? Do you have any empirical evidence you have consciousness? And you see, you break it down to something that is within themselves. Because I believe, I think there's a very good ayah, I forget exactly the reference for that, where Allah tells you to look beyond the horizon and within yourselves. And this beautiful ayah is actually speaking to these people who deny God, and they deny that they will die they do not deny the death that is inevitable. So regardless of your faith or lack thereof, they actually accept that, but they deny that they will be one day raised again to life. And this life is temporary. This life of test is something which is temporary. You live a few decades and 70, 80, I don't know, maybe even a century if you're lucky. But after that, if you're fortunate, after that, you will die one day. So what is the purpose of this limited life you've been given? Ask them philosophical questions, and they probably just say, I don't know. You ask them, where did the universe come from? I don't know. You see, these kind of conversations actually, we are hoping it'll make them think, it'll make them reflect on who they are and where they come from and what is the purpose of their life. And if there is a life after that, then what will happen? What have you done to prepare for it? So these are the questions you ask them, just so it kind of provokes some sort of thought within them. So if you ask them, I mean, I think there's this, what is called the Newton's, not Newton, sorry, Pascal's wager. So when you ask them about that if there is life after that and there really is God, what have you done to prepare for it? Who's taking the bigger risk? The person who believes in God, and let's say for the sake of argument that there is, after you die, there's nothing. You just become ash or dust or whatever it is, and there's no God, there's no angels, there's no day of judgment. Yes, what have I as a person who, based on my faith, have been led to believe a moral, upright life. What have I lost? Yes? What am I risking? In comparison, if you flip to the other side where there is a God and there is a life after that, and there is going to be a day of judgment where everybody is going to be accountable for their deeds that they have done in this life, then what have you done to prepare for it? Because you have denied all of that. Yes? So you're taking the bigger risk in your life, not us. So at the end of the day, if you do not believe in God, and if you have already closed your mind, because as a person who believes in science and believes in logic and believes in rationality, why would you not keep open that avenue where there is the possibility that there is a God who's the one who's created all of us, and he's put into effect all these different laws of physics and gravity and so on? Why would you not keep that avenue open? Yes, because to me, that is an open-minded person. So yeah, I mean, just deal with it rationally, I would say, people like that, because at the end of the day, we just hope and we pray for them, that we give them the message. And as far as the dua are concerned, this is our duty. It's not for us. Hidayah is in the hands of Allah. Hidayah means guidance is in the hands of Allah. Even the Prophet ﷺ couldn't impart Hidayah to his own uncles, so his own family. This shows that Hidayah, which is guidance, ultimate guidance, comes from Allah. And this comes to people who are sincere, those people who are not basically arrogant and not too filled with pride to see all the other options available to them. It comes to them. So if they are open-minded, they are sincere, then inshallah, we believe, God willing, that they will get the Hidayah to see the truth and hopefully have a life in the hereafter, which is an everlasting life, and to prepare for that in this dunya while they have got the opportunity while they live.
Absolutely. And I think I think the psychological sort of dimension that you've been highlighting here is key. And this is really the game changer here, because you can give two people the same logic, but if one of them has a psychological state of hubris and jest, and the other one has a psychological state in which they're fearing nihilism, what the meaning of life is, or why they exist, or what's the point of life, you get two different reactions. Now we're going to play a clip and then get the thoughts of you guys on this, inshallah. So they should. Here we go.
Common sense that came out in a lot of religions about common decency, about things like that's basically like stuff and yes, it's in a religious text, but it's also sensible, right? You'll find the same thing in a lot of religions where it's not necessarily inherently religious, it's just it's another person. Like there's so many things that people could agree on in religions, I'm glad this is
because some people have this this negative feeling or attitude towards religious people. The general, it's like a consensus among the educated class, among the scientific community, that the religious people are not really very intelligent enough or educated enough, or somehow they're not really sane people. Because how can you, in the modern century of science and technology, believe in these old myths and so on? But if only they understood why people believe in the first place. Is it firmly rooted in deep-held convictions based on solid foundations, or is it just some kind of fairy tales? The belief, like we believe in the existence of a creator. I mean, when we discuss with atheists, we are able to demonstrate why this is the most rational position to take, to believe that there is something that is eternally existing for all this existence. Otherwise, you can't explain the mere existence of us being here, because something that.
Sorry, I was on mute there. The audio was not too clear. I did manage to understand the gist of what was going on. So Mansur, maybe if you could just firstly remind us what was happening in the video and then give your thoughts on it.
Sure, if I can remember. I mean, this was just before the beginning of the lockdown, where we still had some issues of coronavirus going on, and measures were coming to effect slowly but not robustly. So just like the stringent measures that we had, talking about, like, should we stop shaking hands and have social distancing and so on. So this gentleman was just passing by and wanted to know exactly what was happening in terms of the discussion that takes place. And I was trying to bring into light how people's perception of religious people especially when I say people, I mean the atheists and agnostics, or people who they consider themselves very secular and not religious. Their perception of religious people have gone to an extreme view, in an extreme form, and that's a bit worrying, where they somehow are now thinking that religious people are backward, uneducated, they can't think critically, they're not very rational human being and not reasonable. And I was making the point that if you were to ask a religious person, if you were to ask a Muslim why we believe in what we believe, then we would have understood our position. I mean, our deep convictions comes from a solid foundation, and that foundation is something that is rooted in rationality, rooted in reason, rooted in common sense, and rooted, of course, from scripture. But there is no conflict in terms of how we don't live in a bubble of fantasy, but we live in in a world where the world can be explained with reason and rationality, and there is no conflict in terms of this ideological view compared to the view they have with the scientific paradigm, for example. Yeah, that's briefly what I can understand what the discussion was.
Yeah, and I think people are always very much surprised at this idea that, wait a minute, you're educated and you believe in God, you have a degree in science and you believe in God, you're working in a hospital and you believe in God, and that surprise gives away a lot of hints at the way that they're actually thinking. And one of the things which sort of sticks with me is when we think about great scientists in the past, like Newton, a lot of people don't recognize that, he was a very strong believer in God. He was a Christian. And I think even though he was a Christian, I think the likes of Hashim even would have given him an easy pass because he didn't believe in the Trinity. He actually was a Unitarian Christian. And he wrote as much about theology as he wrote about physics. So his religiosity and his thirst for scientific advancement, they did not conflict. And, we need to keep reminding people of this because, they seem to think as if atheists came up with science, atheists have always been running science. If we do a sort of tally of the vast majority of people that have been involved in the scientific enterprise for the past 1,000 years, since the time of Hassan ibn Haytham, we could easily say 90% at least were believers in God in some sort. Muslims, Jews, Christians, all the rest. So, it's not surprising at all. It shouldn't be surprising at all that a religious person, has no problem with science and working within that paradigm. Now, Imran, I want to bring you in here. Something you said earlier, but you didn't really elaborate on it much because you're sort of giving your introductory thoughts. You mentioned that you need God not only as a motivation for science, but you also need God for a foundation of science.
Yeah.
And you previously, I've heard you in talks speak about how truth itself is undermined from a purely naturalistic perspective, right? Because you can survive on true beliefs and false beliefs. So science fundamentally is a quest for some sort of truth, right? Whether we can reach it or not, it's still a quest for truth. So could you explain what you meant when you were basically explaining that?
Yeah. Just before I do that, I think just a point on the question you were discussing a second ago. I think it's very important. There is a lack of understanding on the part of most non-Muslims today in regards to what Islam has to say in regards to reason and rationality. So what they don't understand is that Islam actually promotes reasoning and promotes us to understand the world and study the world and to learn and to acquire knowledge. This is information most non-Muslims don't know, and I think one of the reasons is, bro, it's historical because and obviously coupled with this new atheist movement, which is pushing this whole idea that Islam and science just are on opposing sides. But historically speaking, if you look at it, it's either reason or it was religion. So Christianity historically was very averse to free thinking and reason, and that's left its own impression on the minds of people. And what they do is they superimpose that across the board onto all religions, right? They say, okay, if Christianity was like this and it opposed free thinking and etc., then Islam should be the same as well. But that's not the case. If you look at Islam brings a beautiful balance to all of these different dimensions. And it's something I think non-Muslims should really look into. To be honest, it takes a simple reading of the Quran to start to appreciate these things, inshallah. But it's a case of actually people willing to do that as opposed to listening to certain spokespersons on Islam who think they know what they're talking about. But so that being said, I think going back to the point you mentioned about is the foundations of science requiring God. Now, again, it's something we don't think about because most of the discourse that takes place with atheists is not on the level of on the foundational level. Okay, let's talk about foundations, the groundwork before we discuss things. Most of the time, what ends up happening is we end up putting God on trial, assuming the atheist has the position based on his worldview to engage in that type of discussion, right? So we need to go right to the foundations. Okay, so if you adopt atheism or naturalism, and generally the idea is that, okay, there is no God, there's no creator, everything that exists is a result of just random physical processes, right? It's one big accident, essentially. In the simplest way I could put it, according to this sort of naturalistic atheist outlook, everything is one big accident. There is no creator, there is no intelligence, there is no mind, there's nothing that brought everything into existence, right? Now, if that's the case, then everything about us and our being is also accidental, right? Now, you may want to look at that from one specific perspective of evolution. They may bring the whole evolution card into it and say, well, we evolved to survive and pass on our genes. And therefore, rational faculties or truth-bearing rational faculties are necessary for survival. But they're not really necessary for survival when you think about it. This has been discussed. For example, Anthony O'Hare, he's got a book called Beyond Evolution, I think published by Oxford Press. He even mentions, look, when it comes to survival is not contingent upon truth. You can have true beliefs as well as false beliefs, which can both in different situations adequately result in survival. And therefore, there's no reason for truth-bearing rational faculties to develop. Those very faculties that we require to be able to engage in disciplines such as science. Because for us to engage in the discipline of science, there are some assumptions. One of the assumptions is that we have the ability to understand things, and we have faculties which are ordered enough to be able to understand truth and eventually get to truth. Without this assumption, we won't have science, we won't have any discipline, right? So that reality that we have truth-bearing rational faculties that we assume cannot be accounted for on a purely naturalistic paradigm, a purely Darwinistic type of outlook. You can't account for these truth-bearing faculties. At best, what you have to do is you have to remain skeptical. Right, and if you become skeptical about your ability to reason, well, you can't move from that position now. You're stuck. Where do you go from there? Right? You just whatever you say, well, it's up in the air. It's neither true or false. There's no way of knowing if it's true or not. So the point I'm getting at is, if you really deconstruct atheism and naturalism and all of these ideologies and philosophies, and you go right to the foundations, what you realize is that they cut you off from those very things that you know to be true, and those very things that you need to be able to engage in disciplines such as science. And I would argue that God provides a very beautiful explanation for our rational faculties, and Islam in particular provides a very comprehensive understanding of why we have ended up with the ability to do science. And just quickly, in a nutshell, well, how does God explain it? Well, God exists, He's all powerful, He created us, and He created our rational faculties. Very simple. It's not difficult for God to do. Why did He create our rational faculties? Now, Islam gives you a more specific answer. Well, as we said earlier, well, God made us rational. He gave us the ability to study the world, because what is the world at the end of the day? The world is full of the signs of Allah. It's God's it's God's power manifest, basically. God has created everything that exists. And as God says in the Quran, everything in existence is a sign, right? There are signs around us, as Brother Hashim mentioned earlier, that they will find signs within them and in the world around them. So the signs of God are everywhere. And God has given us rational faculties to be able to pick up on these signs, to study the world around us, pick up on these signs. Why? Because inevitably, when you pick up on the signs of God and you appreciate God's power and majesty through just studying this amazing world that we live in, right? And this is something, subhanAllah, scientists do all the time, that should naturally lead you to the appreciation of who God is, and therefore to thank God and to worship Him. And therefore facilitating what this whole process is doing, it's facilitating us fulfilling the purpose of our existence, as Allah says in the Quran, which is to know Him and to worship Him, right? So us thanking Allah, being grateful, acknowledging Him, is worshiping Him. So that's essentially why we've been given these faculties and abilities, alongside obviously to now exercise them, do good, help humanity, take care of people, because all of that comes into worship. So Islam comprehensively and in a very beautiful way answers our, the realities of our existence, or provides an account for the reality of human existence, the abilities that we have rationally, the amazing universe that we live in, all of these things. But without God, without Islam, you're left in this void where you just have these abilities. We can do all of these amazing things, but when you ask for an account, there is no account, right? So, and there's something for people to think about. And within this itself is a sign for people that really think and reflect about these things.
Yeah, definitely. And I like the way that you juxtapose, the Islamic sort of ideal of, worshipping Allah and using our faculties to get closer to Allah, and the evolutionary paradigm, which is essentially just survival and reproduction, right? And you can survive on true beliefs or false beliefs. Now, since you were talking about survival, I started thinking about this virus has brought out the worst in humanity, right? In terms of, if you look at how people are going crazy in terms of shopping and hoarding and not sharing, and there's even people doing fraud, buying face masks and selling them at a very high price. So I want to bring in Dr. Imran here. Selfishness is obviously a trait which I don't think any human being can escape from, but we just try and mitigate it to the best of our abilities. And if someone is an atheist and this life is all that there is, and if someone's a believer in God, in which you have something else to look forward to, is it a cliche to simply say that, the atheist is going to be more likely to be more selfish, or is there some truth in that?
Alhamdulillah, it's a great question, and I just want to touch on just one thing before sort of thinking about it. Is that because obviously when you go through any university process, particularly a science background, so all of the brothers that have done degrees that are science-based, there is a conflation amongst most people. So I was experiencing this when I was sort of studying, and you come across your colleagues, that science and truth are the same thing. And the only thing that you can use to learn about truth, so the mechanism to find truth, is science. And it's also thought that this is somehow the only thing that is rational. Whereas what we know is that rationality, and then there are subsets, and amongst the subsets is science. So rationality is a much broader thing. And as Brother sort of Imran was mentioning earlier on, so this is widespread amongst the youth. And I think this is part of the problem, that they are not aware of the fundamentals, as you mentioned, Imran, that the things that you have to explain before you can explain your explanation, these are required. So this is what is built upon. This is upon which all of our then statements are built, our initial rationality, etc., and explanation for that. And this is not even mentioned. And I think this is something maybe that the youth have to think about. All of the science I learned, all of it, 98% of it was testimonial. I was told that this person said in this book that this is what happens, and I memorized it. That was really the process. There were a few experiments that I did. Apart from those few empirical tests, everything else was I've believed what other people have told me, that this is what has happened if you do this experiment. So it's all been testimonial. But people seem to think that this is not testimonial, and this is somehow that they sort of almost put themselves in the position of having done the experiments. And so often when people argue about science, and one of the things I say is, well, which of these experiments have you verified empirically for yourself? And usually they have no idea why I'm asking the question even. But sorry, that was just a thought that came up with the brother when you were speaking, Imran. Sorry, back to your question. What were you? Remind me of your question.
Yeah. So before I remind you of the question, totally agree with you. I mean, it's one of the aspects of scientism, the overconfidence and the philosophical disposition, we should say, of the idea that science can give you all truth, which is why they pit science versus God, and they make this false dichotomy, which is based upon this idea that only science gives truth, and since science doesn't prove God, therefore there's no God. So my question was about, this virus has brought out a lot of selfishness, right? Yes. And it brought out a lot of this sort of selfish behavior. And how does faith help to mitigate that behavior? Whereas a purely atheistic, nihilistic worldview, you would have no reason not to be selfish.
Sure. And I think that's a really great question, because there is a little bit of a paradox here. You do see people who are from a background, if you said to them, are you religious, do you believe in God, they would say no. But you see them behaving in a way that is not my self-preservation and sending my genes forward. You see them behaving in a way which is altruistic, and much more so if you have a religious background, because your worldview is based upon the fact that this life, I'm here in this life by design. The reason for me being here is purposeful, and this is the purpose, and part of that is to display good character and be beneficial for the people around me. So you particularly see many religious groups, their organizations spring up which are designed to help the people who are in need, get the homeless off the streets, free food banks, or free food being passed out. A lot of the organizations which do this have some sort of religious underpinning. And definitely what you see is that if I just to give a personal example, when we were seeing all these reports of people buying lots and lots of things, stacking their trolleys full of bags of rice, etc. I used to go out shopping as well. I used to sort of grab something. My mum would say, "Don't buy too much," and I was surprised by because obviously in your mind you have this sort of my mind is like, I'm going to be at work a lot. I'm not going to be able to do the shopping. Everyone needs to stay inside. Let me just get a few extra. And my mum was telling me off for you've brought 3. We don't need 3. We just need 2. This is fine. And literally it humbled me in the sense that my mum, the faith in it will be okay in the end because we leave everything in the hands of Allah. And this sort of thing that you find, I mean, specifically I'm talking about my own Islamic experience, but this is what a belief in a higher power and a purpose for being here does for you. Yeah. You don't despair. You don't build a bomb shelter and put all of your tins of tomatoes and chickpeas that you're going to chew on for the next 4 years into there. You don't do that. Because we have a bigger paradigm, and we also know that if our life is limited, it's going to go on to something. It's just this moment that's limited. We're on a journey that's going to go on perpetually, but this is just part of that journey, and it's not all about now. It's not all about here, and so that what that allows us to do is not behave in ways that would be considered selfish. I'm not saying that all Muslims do this, but we have a basis for this sort of behavior. Now, when I see people who are not of a religious background, so atheists, for example, who then say, I've given this away to this, and I'm happy that is, but why that is, I'm happy that that's happened, but I'm curious as to why that is, because what they're doing is going against the whole Darwinian thing about we need to. Even the idea that our consciousness is an illusion for our genes to pass on themselves. Yeah. And so same for our altruism, for example. But it just doesn't. This makes no sense whatsoever. And I see this person deriving great personal satisfaction from having helped someone 1,000 miles away, 2,000 miles away, who they will never get any benefit from. Yeah. And for me, so it is a bit of a cliche that only religious people have this sort of Assalamu alaikum, Brother Jordan.
Wa alaikum salam.
That only religious people have this sort of drive. But actually, it's important because if you're looking at worldviews, your basis for these decisions you're making, then definitely our belief in a higher power and a purpose for being here is a great driver for you to be selfless. Yeah. SubhanAllah, So I agree with you completely. So it is a cliche. But in terms of worldviews, then it becomes sort of realities. You have to put your realities together, and may Allah make us of those who will sort of accept and have greater iman and be able to sort of help those around us even more, inshallah.
Ameen. Jazakallah khair. And I really like that story you gave about your mother. May Allah preserve her, and her advice to basically not hoard. And it reminded me of the narration of the Prophet ﷺ that don't hoard or Allah would withhold from you, right? And, as human beings, we need a bit of a carrot, a bit of a stick. And it's always a good reminder that, there's consequences to these actions that we take, and we need to put our trust in Allah. So, Assalamu alaikum, Jordan.
Wa alaikum salam. How's everyone, all right?
I'm doing well.
My apologies if people were expecting a special guest. You got me, I'm afraid.
Mashallah, you're special.
You are special.
You're a bit dark. Could you switch on the light? I
think my camera probably frozen as well. Let me have a look.
It's okay now.
Okay.
Oh yeah, cameras are freezing.
You just made me smile at the irony of calling the only white guy the dark one.
Okay. So Jordan, obviously being somebody who accepted Islam and previously holding a different perspective and then coming to a new perspective, when it comes to something like the impact on our personal lives when it comes to this particular virus and the increase in faith that we have in these times, I wanted to ask you, is it the case that even non-Muslims, even though they may not be thinking about religion in the conventional sense that we are, do you think this virus has brought about a sort of change in the air where people are much more likely to discuss belief in God, to discuss the meaning of life, and these sorts of things?
Yeah, good question. I hope so. I think the biggest thing for me in terms of embracing Islam was the realization that I don't know everything, that I'm not the person to guide myself. Before, I was being guided from the government, from people around me. So in embracing Islam, I think one has to sort of humble themselves into that position, which I believe now I have. Now, I guess, are people now going to be asking the big questions? I guess, to be honest, for people that are maybe losing loved ones and things like that, I can imagine it probably is. My pessimistic side is probably that, in a couple of months' time, if this kind of starts to go back to normal, everything will start going back to normal again.
Yep.
So yeah, that's my probably thought on whether it will be, because it should be the perfect time for Dawah now, shouldn't it? It should be the perfect time for people to really ask themselves the big questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure if people, because I think for me, if I was still non-Muslim now, I think I would still be fairly sort of, I'd be looking to guide myself there. And I think people laugh at the toilet roll sort of saga where everyone was going out and buying toilet rolls. What that was an example of, because not everyone needed the toilet roll, but everyone was just following each other. Everyone was just following what the next person needs. Whereas obviously as a religious person, for me, rather than looking at the next person buying toilet roll, I'm now looking at, well, what does the Prophet be on him say about hoarding? What does he say about that? So you're taken out of this kind of sheep mentality that we're often accused of.
Yeah.
But yeah, look, I hope it is a time when people ask themselves big questions.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think to an extent it has brought about those questions, which at least on a personal level, maybe not at a state level where, the Prime Minister is talking about this, but that's perhaps because we're in the early days, and the impact of this particular virus upon a developed nation like the UK is very different to the impact of the virus upon, say, the Philippines, where people are going through a lot more of a rough patch. And I think that the fact that we're in a country that's very comfortable, and even in a virus pandemic, the government is basically paying for people who are unemployed. There's still food, there's still water, there's still security. So I think that's one of the reasons why perhaps it hasn't got to the level where it has in other countries. I think certainly in poorer countries, that the conversations are a lot more frank, a lot more candid. A lot of people are way more likely to, accept that, look, we need to start talking about these things. So we're running out of time, and I want to sort of go back to Mansur here. So Mansur, science, as we know, and like Brother Imran mentioned, Dr. Imran mentioned, that it's a subset of reason, right? And it doesn't, negate God. Science, if you like, tries to explain how the world works. God is an explanation for why anything exists. So, one doesn't undermine the other. However, my question to you is, one of the things that's been leveled against Muslims during this whole pandemic, right, is the people looking for the cures and the people who are developing the vaccines, and the people right at the forefront and the if you like, the cream of the scientific society right now, looking for the cure, are non-Muslims. The vast majority of them non-Muslims. Whether they're Christians or atheists are sort of very irrelevant here. But the sort of swipe that's taken against us is, well, look how backwards you guys are. You know, you're not at the forefront looking for cures. Therefore, there's something wrong with Islam. How would you respond to this?
Interesting question. I mean, I think there's a lot of faulty assumptions there in the first place, that it's only the non-Muslims scientists are in the forefront. In the past, it was quite easy to say whether it's coming from the Muslim scientists or other scientists, but now Muslims, non-Muslims, Christians, atheists, they're all integrated within the scientific field of discovery and, you know, bringing up treatments and so on and so forth. So it would be very difficult to pinpoint saying which religious denomination of people or which religious faith communities are behind scientific advancements, because now science is no longer a group, you know, issue where people only from a particular group contributes to it. Everyone's contributing as best as they can. So Muslims are there in front of science and discovering, as well as discovering for the cure and the treatment for this coronavirus. So it's absolutely wrong to say they aren't there. I mean, I don't have to name individuals. If you look at all the clinical trials that are happening to discover the treatment or the vaccines, and the people who work within this establishment of the established bodies of pharmaceutical companies, Muslims are everywhere. So it's wrong to assume that Muslims are not there. But I want to bring to your attention one important thing, though. We are talking about cure. Of course, I mean, as I alluded to earlier, cure is something that Islam encourages. One thing we haven't touched upon is the prevention, because prevention is essentially very important when we're talking about disease and health. When we talk about either prevention of cancer or other diseases, I mean, think about the problems of obesity, for example. How many people are obese in America, for example, and why people are obese? And if you compare the teachings of how we can prevent disease from the statements of the Quran, from the prophetic narrations and the teachings, we'll be amazed. I just want to touch upon a few things on this, because we haven't actually covered these subjects. When it comes to, say, in terms of preventing disease, we are talking about being clean, being the most of our in our hygiene status, whether we wash our hands before our food or before we, you know, come out of the toilets and so on. This is an integral teaching, part of the Islamic core teaching Islam, where we consider the tahara or purity being almost half of faith. I mean, which religion or which non-religious ideas considers, you know, being clean and being pure is half of your, you know, ideological perspective? Islam says that purity is half of faith. So in terms of taking ghusl, and before we, you know, pray, every time we are washing our hands, we're making ablutions. So it's not only a spiritual cleansing, there are physical cleansings at the same time. Whether we are urinating, how we are urinating. We don't urinate while standing. This is our Prophet ﷺ forbade that, because, I mean, if you compare the understanding now we have in even our health systems, how are men urinating in the loos, for example, in the jets? They urinate while standing, and as we all know, the sprays of urine comes back to you. So it's not very hygienic. Our Prophet ﷺ said, you know, you urinate sitting, so you don't actually spray back all the urines onto you. Even relieving and how you cleanse yourself. I mean, it has to be said, even the basic hygiene is lacking in our world today when we're talking about health and science. It's encouraged to use, you know, if you didn't have anything, stones or whatever you can find, and also wash yourself with water. How many times we have seen, even the hospitals, Dr. Imran, people coming out of the toilet without even going to wash their hands. We're talking about adults, but we are seriously encouraged with our daily practices of how to cleanse ourselves with water and purify ourselves. How to look after our environment. I mean, we are told not to relieve ourselves in the places where people will need and utilize this place. I mean, we're talking about not just in developed countries, or even countries where it's not developed, where people don't have the actual sanitation proper. but still you can't just urinate or relieve yourself in any place that you want. We are told to cleanse ourselves, and it is part of our fitrah, where we have to make sure we cut our nails, and how many or how much infection that you can actually contain and spread through the germs that you carry along your nails. We are told to cut the pubic hair, to trim our mustache, and to have circumcision for males. All of this, if you think about it, these are all linked to disease prevention. In terms of taking the thorn from the road, how we're looking after the environment, how the Quran says not to make an imbalance of the balance that Allah has set, not to corrupt the earth, not to corrupt the air, not to corrupt the land and the seas by making pollutions out of it, not to cut the trees. I mean, even if you're in a warfare, I mean, from the Islamic historical perspective, if there's a warfare there, you don't cut down the trees, and you don't destroy the crops. This is how we're looking after the environment. And when we are drinking water, for example, we are told to drink sitting. I mean, why don't we drink standing? There's a medical reasons for this. I mean, we can touch upon this if we need to. When we eat, we are told not to eat in our full stomach. Eat 1/3 and leave 1/3 for air and 1/3 for water, for example, so that you're always in a very controlled eating. So the question of obesity doesn't arise in the first place. And when we're talking about sleeping, for example, we are told to put down or put off the lamps, because if these were lamps which make of flames, you don't know when you're asleep, you can't catch fire, for example. You tie the utensils, you cover your drinking pots. Every single one of these, I mean, if you think about it, they're linked to our health and safety and the prevention of disease. We are told quite categorically not to consume alcohol. Why is this? Because it's not only just a spiritual thing that you don't drink alcohol, because alcohol seems to be part and parcel of a society where they're socialized, but it brings a lot of health disasters. Our A&Es are full of people because of crimes committed, violent crimes under the influence of alcohol. Islam says no to that, at all, and I don't even approach alcohol. So disease prevention is a key before we talk about how we cure the diseases. And Islam provides this ethos, provides this platform in which we will not suffer later to find the cure when we can prevent it. So this is something that I wanted to touch upon, because it's not something that people think about it, because prevention is better than cure.
That's absolutely correct. And, it sort of reminds me of flights were still coming into the rest of the world, even though this pandemic had broken out. And, I'm not somebody who obviously agrees with President Trump, but, he did make a very interesting point in a press conference, which is, well, if flights stopped, the virus wouldn't have left China. And this is true. I mean, even right now, flights are going from countries to others, and prevention is definitely better than cure. If we imagine that, the advice of the Prophet ﷺ, that you do not enter a land which has the plague, you do not leave the land that has a plague. We seem to think, when we look at the ancients, we seem to think that they were barbarians, that they were, irrational cavemen, when many of the things in the ancient world, the wisdoms that we have from the ancient world and even from religion, they're not being used today by people who are supposedly in the 21st century far more superior and intellectual. And in fact, the personal hygiene and these types of things that you highlighted, I mean, the ancients, some of them, they were far more sophisticated than people in sometimes very industrialized and developed countries. So absolutely, and I really love the point that you made, that maybe a few centuries ago is very clear and very easy to demarcate, who is a Muslim, who is a Christian, who's leading science. When currently the whole scientific enterprise is an open one, in which you have atheists, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroasters, and even people from Southall working together to look for cures. And it's irrelevant. It's totally irrelevant, and you cannot even find out, who's basically publishing these things. And we have this collective movement of science. It's very hard to say, right, science is being basically done by atheists and everybody else is at the wayside, you know. And I think that's a really important message to basically take home. So thank you to all of you for coming onto this live session. I had a lot of fun. I learned a lot of things. I definitely took away some stories, and I'm a big story person. So Jazakallah khair, may Allah bless you, may Allah preserve you guys, and inshallah next Sunday we will be live again. So make sure that you subscribe to SCDawah, you tune in at that time, and you also ask questions. So from all of us, Jazakallah khair, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers.
Assalamu alaikum.